Hi, I'm Jeremy Duffy, and I'm going to teach you LifeSec, or Life Security, which is an advanced form of operations security that I developed because, let's face it, operations security is boring. It's threat analysis, it's math, and most people are just not interested. It's a pretty tough sell. For example, one of my coworkers at the time was trying to convince a base commander that he needed an OPSEC program, but the commander wasn't buying it. So he went back to the office and just looked the commander up online, read his bio that had his wife's name listed and his kids, and figured maybe one of them's on Facebook. Looked him up, and sure enough, the oldest daughter was on Facebook, had her photo, had her class schedule at the University of Maryland, which was only a few miles from our office. So he grabbed a buddy and a camera, and they went down to the quad and they waited. She came out of the chem building or whatever and sat down on a bench. Now, he didn't talk to her or anything. He just sat down on the opposite side of the bench, had his photo taken, and then threw it down on the commander's desk and said, "That is why you need an OPSEC program." The key is you want to start thinking about security before it becomes a problem. For example, this Japanese idol singer, I want to tell you right now, she's okay, but she was found and attacked by a stalker because he was watching the photo she uploaded, and in one of them, he noticed the reflection of a sign at a particular train station that he recognized, and that helped him find her. Now, if you're thinking, well, I'm not famous or important like that, I've got nobody obsessing over me, that's fine, but do you have a race, a religion, or a gender? Because some people are really dedicated to hating and harming, and it might be enough that you're just different from them, or that you look like someone they hate. They may not be able to tell the difference. I've heard stories of people who assumed that somebody was LGBTQ because they dyed their hair pink or green. And it's extremely easy to draw the wrong kind of attention to yourself by putting out information you didn't even know was a risk. For example, think about the last time you bought a big TV. Where did you put the box? Out in front of your house like a rob me billboard? No, you don't do that. You put it in front of your neighbor's house, whichever one you hate the most. And I am, of course, kidding, but the point is that everybody is at risk. And my goal here is not to scare you and make you go into hiding. It's about showing you the risks that you didn't know about. Stuff like the TV box, which you'll probably remember from now on. I'm going to go through a whole bunch of tips and tricks and ideas like that. But the thing is, it's impossible to protect yourself from every kind of hack that could ever be out there. And that's why I developed LifeSec. It's based on a mentality of security that you don't just leave at work, you carry it with you everywhere. It changes the way you think about information in general, whether you're at the store or at home, on a chat, or anywhere else. And then what you do is you combine these two ideas, learn a little bit about the risks, and keep that mindset of mentality so that you have informed consent about how exposed you want to be. Some people just want to duck and cover, and that's fine. Some people want to be advocates and out there and fighting the good fight, and that's fine too. But either way, you don't want to draw attention and risk that you weren't expecting. So the first risk I want to teach you about is oversharing. As an example of what I mean, when I was in undergrad, I had a professor who, when people saw him coming down the hall, they would turn on their heel and walk the other way, or dive into a bathroom or out a window or anything to avoid him. And it's not because he was mean or rude or smelly. It was because he told long, rambling, unescapable stories with way too much information. You might ask him about an assignment, and he'd say, "Oh, yeah, that reminds me of the time I lived in Kansas with my dog Trigger in '72. And no, wait a minute, I had Rocket in '72, so that must have been in '73 when we moved to Kansas. Yeah, out in Kansas they have really nice fields. I really loved it. Oh my God, I'm so bored. What are you doing?" And that same concept is something that people do naturally if they're not on guard. Oversharing is quite boring, but it is also very risky. For example, there was a kid who wore a character backpack for a cartoon that he liked, and the people at school decided that that was not the right kind of cartoon and bullied him mercilessly for that. Obama's Twitter got hacked by a French guy who didn't speak English or know how to hack simply because he unlocked the account with the challenge questions. Turns out you can look up Obama's mother's maiden name and the name of his dog. And what about people who are posting all about their vacation while they're still on vacation? That's a green light for thieves to come take all your stuff. And the insurance companies have caught on to that and are sometimes denying claims if they find out that you've been doing that. And there's even a case where a guy was playing Call of Duty with some kid who was mocking him constantly, over and over, being rude and like kids are sometimes. And the guy found his address somewhere, maybe in one of the kids' profiles, I don't know. But he went to the house, knocked on the door, and then grabbed the kid by the throat and started choking him. And the kid is okay, everything calmed down, but that's a scary scenario. So what do you do? Well, the hard way is to just take your chances. Instead, you want to take a little bit of control. Start thinking about data from a minimalistic perspective. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're in a conversation and you're giving detail and just having a good time. Most people will eventually hit a point in that conversation where they think, well, maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe I've said enough. Maybe I've said too much. But what I recommend is doing the exact opposite and instead always give the bare minimum amount of detail possible. For example, let's say you're traveling overseas and somebody asks, where are you from? They probably don't care about your home address. They just want to know if you're an American or not. So you say America. If you're out of state, saying which state you're from is probably good enough. If they're curious and you are willing to share, or it's in state, you can give the area closest big city. That's usually enough because people probably don't want to know more than that anyway, so why share it? Then let's go back to that commander who had the bio online. Almost everybody in a command position has one of these online, and it lists all this unnecessary detail about their families. Just say, my spouse, my kids, it's close enough. If you're trying to say, man, I feel old, you don't have to say how old. You can just say the range, if even that's necessary. And you never give up somebody else's information. Don't out somebody just because you're having a conversation online. If it's important for someone to know that you have somebody that you love who is LGBTQ or whatever, then just say that. There's no reason to list names. This minimum accuracy idea extends to everything. Think about this for a second. On your phone, you have a map program, and that map program has a home default so that you can say, hey, take me home. It's very cool, right? But is that home your actual house? Why? Can't you just put it on the closest school or convenience store? You know how to get home from there. That's close enough. Same is true when you go online and they ask you for your birthday. Why are they asking you for your birthday? They just want to know that you're over 13 years old, probably, in which case, great. There are lots of dates that are over 13 years, so pick one. And then when you're in a store and they ask you for a phone number before they'll give you any discounts, is it really necessary to give them your phone number? All they need is a phone number. So how about 8675309? So pro tip, every store that I have tried, area code plus the Jenny number has worked, never failed. And this last one is really not necessary, but it's based on a story where I was at a conference and talking with the speaker after the talk, and we noticed that somebody had left their phone on one of the front seats, and that phone was unlocked. And we looked through the contacts to see if we could figure out who it belonged to, but all I could think was how easy it would be to pick the one that said husband or work and send texts that could ruin this lady's life, or pick up the phone and call them by name and say, oh, David, this is blah, blah, blah. There's been an accident. You need to send me money, etc. But the point is that the scams are easier if they know the name. So why not fake the names? All of the names of people in my phone book are nicknames of one kind or another. That way, if for any reason that data got lost or stolen or shared or whatever, and a scammer tried to call my brother and said, hello, is Sunflower there? Pretty sure my brother would catch on that something was wrong. The next risk I want to talk about is accidental oversharing. So you thought you were doing a good job, but it's easy to mess up. For example, have you ever been at a school or conference or on a plane, anywhere in public, where somebody opened their laptop and a video started playing loudly, or there was wallpapers or other things on their screen that they probably didn't want you to see and maybe you didn't want to see either? That's a very easy mistake to make. When you're in a Zoom or Teams call and you're sharing your screen, did you think about what people can see in the tabs or what the bookmarks say or seem to say? And then the icons on your taskbar might also give information that you don't want them to know. Have you ever texted the wrong person, had a chat with the boss over here and the wife over here, and then accidentally sent "I love you" to your boss, which maybe they appreciated, but probably wasn't your intention? As an example of that, I had a problem with a policy at work, and I wrote this detailed email explaining exactly how stupid I thought it was. And then I sent that email directly to the person who implemented the policy by accident. That was not a fun time. So, what do? You can tread carefully every step of the way, every day, all the time, but that is exhausting and frankly impossible. Instead, just separate. Use separation to protect yourself. As an example, when I wrote my book about the NSA, I was legally required as a former employee to send it to them for pre-publication. And when they reviewed it, if they decided that something in that was classified, they are legally allowed to come to my house and confiscate my computers and take them away and maybe never give them back, which is why I wrote the entire book on a completely separate laptop. And when I do work, I have a work laptop and my home laptop, and never the twain shall meet. Another great way to separate is if you have a router that has a guest network option. Then you can put your work laptop and your devices like the Amazon Echo on the guest network. So if there's any kind of problem or hack or vulnerability with that stuff, they're isolated from your network, your computers, your files. And of course, that works if you have house guests too. Same idea. You protect yourselves from each other. And let's say that you don't have multiple computers or that's not practical for some reason. That's fine. Every operating system I know of allows you to set up multiple profiles on your computer. So set one up for your private stuff and then a different one for work-related stuff. That way, if you're at a conference and you open up the computer, click the work profile, and then whatever you were doing with your private one, whatever games you were playing or videos you were watching, they're not going to load. You're just going to see your work background, your work icons, your work bookmarks. Avoid that whole problem. Separating browsers is good to do too. For example, I don't like MS Edge, so I use it only for business things. And as soon as I see Edge, I know I've got to watch what I say and be in professional mode. Otherwise, if I'm on any kind of website that requires logins, I use Firefox. But if I'm out on the open internet, I use Brave, which has the most privacy and security features built in. Email works the same way. I have an email I give out to people that's just business or that I trust the most, and then I use my middle ground email for things that are just standard, basic stuff. And then those websites that force you to give them an email for something that you're probably never going to come back to, you can have a third or a fourth or a fifth email, old accounts that you basically have forgotten about and abandoned. The next risk I want to talk about is elicitation. And the idea here is that you've done everything you were supposed to do to make sure you weren't sharing, not even accidentally, but someone somehow convinced you to give up the information anyway. As an example, decades ago, one of my early jobs was selling this overpriced cookware, and I was at the state fair with the boss, and he had laid out a little survey for people to fill out for some kind of drawing. And the survey asked things like, what's your home address and what's your annual income? And I couldn't believe anybody would fill it out. But he said, they'll fill it out because we asked. And he was right. And that hasn't stopped in all these years. When I watch people fill out web forms, they don't even think about which of these are actually required and which ones aren't. They'll fill out the whole form because it asks for it. Instead, my recommendation is to push the sign up or whatever go button there is, and then all the actually required fields will highlight, and you can just focus on those. And when you're online a lot, maybe you see one of these quizzes, your birthday is one anime character and your birth month is another, and then they fight who wins. Whoa, that's an interesting question. But you're also broadcasting your birthday, your name, the city you're from, and so on and so on. And another way people give up information is Cunningham's Law. One of the creators of Wikipedia said, the best way to get information online is not to post a question, but to post wrong information, because people will feel compelled to correct it. And there are cases where they have caught military people giving away classified information about tanks in video games to win an argument. If you do this on purpose, this is called social engineering. It is a technique to trick people out of information that is valuable. For example, Kevin Mitnick was a famous hacker who was on the FBI's most wanted list because of how successful he was. But he wasn't doing it through hacking as much as he was doing it through social engineering. He was tricking people by calling them and pretending to be who he wasn't so they would give him access to key information. As an example of how easy this can be, my wife once called me and said her friend, let's call her Becky, was having a problem and they didn't know what to do. Becky was trying to build a business on Facebook, but every time she posted, somebody came in with some awful lies about her, just saying anything possible to ruin her reputation. She had an idea of who it might be, but she couldn't prove it because Facebook wouldn't give any information about this person. So they asked me for help. And I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. I went to my website and I posted, hey, I want to work with this Becky person, but I don't know anything about her. If you do, can you please leave a note and let me know? And then I told Becky, go to your Facebook page and type up your own post. And on that post, you're going to say, hey, I want to work with this geek professor guy. This would be a great opportunity for me. So can you please put in a good word? It didn't take more than 30 minutes before I got a comment on my page that said essentially the exact same stuff that was on hers. But on my page, it gives me the IP address of the people who leave comments. So I gave that to her so she could give it to the police. That's how easy it can be. Defending yourself against this kind of trickery is extremely hard. You have to be on guard all the time. But what would help a lot is if you unlearn the sharing reflex. Personally, I believe the sharing reflex is one of the best things about humans, but you do need to get it under control somewhat. For example, I saw one of those quizzes online, and the quiz said, what is your favorite character that shares the same name as you? And I immediately thought of a story when I was a little kid. My dad took me to see a movie in the theaters, and this character showed up on screen. And as soon as he did and he introduced himself, I stood up and shouted, hey, that's my name! And everybody was laughing. It's actually a really funny memory for me. But you have to think about who's asking and why. And they're probably not targeting you, probably. But think about everyone else who sees that post or could find it later. Now they're going to have that information. So you have to ask yourself, is it really necessary? Is there a point to sharing this information? I mean, it was an interesting conversation, but do you really want to leave that nugget out there that ties your online profile to your real name? Because even if the people who posted it aren't a problem, what about the employees? There are plenty of examples where employees have abused information for personal or political gain or straight up identity theft. And there are countless examples of companies losing information either because they lost a laptop or hard drive full of data or some kind of data breach. Or there's the famous case of AOL who released a giant database of users' search history. Now, they removed the username, but they gave them unique numbers so you could still tie everybody's searches together and people were able to be identified that way. And at the very least, companies are going to use this information for their own purposes. Best Buy, for example, was caught labeling customers as either demons or angels, and then they would use that to decide how well to treat you in their stores. But you do have to ask, who cares? So what if they have my first name? So what if they have my birth month? It doesn't mean anything in isolation, and well, you're right. But what if it's not in isolation? What if they're able to collect all this information together? That is the risk of aggregation. So we go back to this story about the Japanese idol. It wasn't the reflection in her eye that put her at risk. That was just one piece of the puzzle. He was watching her photos for months, maybe years, trying to figure out how high her apartment was, which way the sun was facing at what time of day, so he could figure out which side of the building it was on, the color of her curtains to narrow it down even further. And then her post history would drop little nuggets of information like what her neighbors' names were, which stores she liked to stop at. The timing of the posts would give him an idea of what her commute was like. And it was all that together that created the risk. If you think about it, even something as simple as the stickers on the back of your car can tell more than you intended. For example, I found this very low resolution but good photo that explains the problem. If you have a parking sticker that lists your neighborhood, if you have stickers that say where your kids go to school, and other stickers that say what their names are, maybe gives ideas about what they're interested in, putting all that information together can make it much easier for somebody to hurt you. The lesson is that information is a force multiplier, and everybody in national security knows this. They found a document in Manchester, England ages ago that they call the Al-Qaeda Handbook, and in it they talk about how people they're targeting, they want everything they can on them. When they're leaving, when they're coming, what they buy, where they shop, who their neighbors are, who they're friendly with, whether they have any pets, everything. And that's why we have an OPSEC program to protect that information. Based on the information leaks they had in the Vietnam War, that it turns out that the adversary could just figure out what we were going to do based on the placement of the crates that were on the runway the night before. So if bad guys are coming after you, you can count on them trying to get as much information as possible. all your personal details, every photo they can. If they can get your post history, great. Even better if they can get your search history. And what can they do with it? Well, think about just your standard data brokers who are legal corporations in the US that are gathering not just your credit history, but your purchasing history, your professional licenses, your education, everything they can, because it helps them market to you. Some of these data brokers have been caught marketing weight loss to new brides, or the lady who had a pregnancy test and then started getting magazines and samplers for babies long before she'd even told her husband that she was pregnant. And if somebody has enough information about you, they can paint you any way they want, using half-truths or real truths just lined up in a certain way to make you look like something you're not. As an example, when I was putting together this briefing, I was searching for a lot of terms that might look really questionable out of context. And the last thing, don't underestimate just how easy it can be to destroy somebody if you have the right pieces of information. Let's say I know from your post history that you have struggled with alcoholism. But now I see a post that says the wife and kids are going to be out of town this weekend, and I send you a wine of the month sampler, leave it on your doorstep. What happens? There's a very real chance I could destroy your life. That's all terrifying. What are you supposed to do? Well, what you don't do is surrender. Instead, you just assume leaks. You know information is going to flow and gather and pool. And when you do, you treat your information more carefully. Make sure it's in less places at less risk. For example, if you go to a medical office and they say, "What's your social security number?" you shouldn't say, "Here it is." You should say, "Why?" And if they tell you something like, "Well, the insurance company needs it for us to file insurance," you call the company and ask them. And if they say no, like they did in my case, I go back and I say, "You can't have that number. You don't actually need it." And I have never had a problem refusing to give out the social security number in these cases. Another thing to keep in mind is your online profiles. How much information are you putting in there? Your school, your age, dates, whatever? No, and ideally you're not even going to use the same username on one site versus another, because that can line up your information and tie it all together, make you easier to find. You have the option of unlocking your phone or your computer with your fingerprint or your face, but why? Do you know how well they're protecting that information? Because if you don't, and I don't, then it's best not to use it at all. Also, when you're using a computer, they want you to use a Microsoft account or some other online account to log into your computer, but that makes it trivially easy for them to collect information about you, to pull it together, and to profile you. So I'd recommend you don't do that. I only use local accounts, and they're making it harder and harder to do, but it is still possible. Just look up a guide, it'll explain how. When they ask you for information that you know that they don't need, and it's both legal and ethical to do so, which you have to figure out on your own, lie. As a perfect example of this, Obama's Twitter got hacked because he gave real answers to challenge questions, something security experts will tell you not to do, because it's not that hard to get that kind of information about most people. So put in fake information instead. And lastly, there have been lots of breaches where people's photos were exposed, or documents, or whatever. Are you going to put those documents on your phone or on those online storage accounts? Is that actually necessary? And if it is, can you encrypt it instead, so even if it's lost, it's not available to anyone? The next risk I want to talk about is visibility. The idea that we think we're not exposed when we actually are. As an example, I was on a Teams call with a coworker when she said, "I have an emergency, I have to go." And I was concerned. A little while later, she came back and I asked her about it, and she said her husband works in repossession and somebody showed up at the door angry because his car had been repossessed and somehow he'd found their home address. And I said to her, "When your husband files the paperwork, does he put your home address on it? Because that's a legal record." And she said, "Oh no." And that was the problem. Her husband hadn't thought about it, but he needed to use a business address or a post office box instead to protect them. Another famous example is the person who tweeted excitedly about getting a job at Cisco with a fatty paycheck, and that the only downside is that they would have a long commute and really boring work. Well, somebody from Cisco saw it and said, "Who's the manager? I'm sure they'd love to know that you hate the work." And they pulled the job offer. And it can be very hard to put the right controls on your posts. This girl tried to have a birthday party with some RSVPs for her friends, but she configured it wrong and it was publicly visible and it went viral. And over 200,000 people ended up RSVPing for her party. They ended up having to send police to her house to make sure that no weirdos showed up. And what happens if you assume that everyone in your audience understands the words the same way you do. There was a Washington, D.C. administrator who in a city meeting said, we have to be very stingy with the budget this year. Problem was, he didn't say stingy. He used a different word, one that sounds a lot like a racial slur. And I had to look it up, and I confirmed this word has nothing to do with the other one. They're not even closely related. But knowing that doesn't change anything. In the face of all the outrage, he ended up having to quit his job. And just because you tell a joke in the United States doesn't mean it won't travel somewhere where they take it a lot more seriously. There was a comedian who talked about having grown up in Singapore and that Singapore and Malaysia had this rocky relationship, but Singapore had broken it off and had a big glow up after they left Malaysia behind. Well, turns out people in Malaysia took that really personally. They started review bombing her, attempting to hack her websites, and harassing her online. Reportedly, the Malaysian police even tried to recruit Interpol to have her arrested and extradited. And what happens if a key symbol of your faith is adopted by a maniac, and from then on, everybody thinks that symbol is associated with that maniac, even though it's been part of your religion for over 10,000 years? In all these cases, trying to get people to calm down once they have picked up their pitchforks and torches is basically impossible. Your only options are to brace for impact or try to be more proactive and anticipate the risks before you share and then adjust accordingly. For example, before you post, maybe it's a good idea to just assume that your spouse sees it and your boss and maybe the angry hordes on the internet. And are you still comfortable posting? Maybe. Maybe you choose to take the risk and face it head on. This comedian fought back, and eventually, because she had the right platform and enough notoriety, she was able to turn the situation around, and even to her favor in some ways. Another way is to at least lower the risk. You have a choice sometimes about when you post, what you post, and especially the words you say. And pro tip, maybe choose words that can't in any way possibly be confused for a racial slur. And the last option is to avoid the risk. No matter how strongly you believe in a cause or a religion or whatever else it is, if you don't want to risk the outrage and having to explain yourself and dealing with those consequences, maybe you turn the camera off or spin the computer around where it's not pointing at any symbols that would cause you issues. And I want to be very, very clear. Your choice on how to respond to this is your choice and no one else's. No one gets to choose how much risk you're willing to take on for your situation. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is photos. When I was in undergrad, they took a photo of some students in the server room and put it on the brochures for the computer science department without realizing that there was a visible sticky note behind them that listed the passwords to the servers. And you would be surprised how often something like that happens. You have to check the details that are visible in the photo. Maybe it's a piece of mail on the table that I can see your address. Or if you have your keys there and I can see the ridges, you can actually copy a key very easily that way. There was a researcher who took a photo of a key from 200 feet away and was still able to replicate that key. Another thing people don't think about is just how powerful these cameras are. If you're pointing a 40 megapixel camera at your hand to take a picture of a bug or a button or a piece of art or a leaf or whatever, you may have just taken a perfect photo of your fingerprints and uploaded them to the internet. This happens a lot more than you think. What about this lady who was super excited to win the lottery and took a selfie with the ticket, not realizing that if you have the numbers, you can go down to the store and say, oh, give me these numbers, and her friend stole her winnings. And always check the reflective surfaces in your photos. I once found a hutch that I wanted in these classified ads and asked the lady for a photo. Well, she sent me a photo, and in the glass front of the hutch, I could see the reflection of her in her underwear taking the photo. And I never told her that I saw her in her underwear, but I have told several thousand people since then. And a new risk that you may not have heard of is AI analysis. I picked a random photo off Google Maps and fed it into AI analysis to see if it could find it. And it came within 11 miles, just based on the trees, the signs, the streets, and buildings that were visible. So you might want to think twice about posting photos of you on your street or in your backyard, depending on what's visible. But what's even easier is if somebody uploads a photo that has location data attached to it. If you've been online to places like Flickr or various other places, sometimes you'll see a little map like this that says where the photo was taken. It's not because they added that information, it's because it was in the metadata of the photo added by the phone automatically if you didn't turn that feature off. And I remember we used to have to constantly teach the military to stop posting photos online with them in front of the weapons depot, or if they were on a boat somewhere that was supposed to be classified information, they were painting targets on themselves. So photos are extremely risky, but what do you do about it? Do you have the time or skills to edit out all the problems? Instead, I'd say just simplify the problem. For instance, you can crop a photo and get rid of problem areas. That's one. Another and better way is to just shrink the photo. The vast majority of the problems that I talked about are because the backgrounds and details were easy to see because of the high resolution of the photo. So if you shrink it down enough that it still looks good online, but you can't zoom in to see fingerprints or eye reflections, it solves so many of those problems. Worst case scenario, if you think that the photo might be a problem, but you don't have the time or skill to clean it up, maybe just don't post it. So at this point, I want you to breathe. Usually by this point in my briefings, people will tell me how much I scared them, but that is not the point. This is about empowerment, making sure that you have the information and the tools available to lower your risk and keep you and the people you care about safe when you're out and about, when you're advocating online, or just minding your own business and existing. But I understand I covered a lot of information very quickly, and there's no way you're going to retain it all. So go to my website and you'll see this same information, or on the next slide, I will show you a UPC code you can scan to give me some feedback on my webpage. And when you do, I will send you for free a handout summary of this talk and all my talks. Feel free to share it with your family, or if you know any event coordinators at work or at conference or anywhere else that you think they need to see one of these presentations, make sure to give them a copy. Now, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll answer what I can. But at the very, very least, I hope that something I said makes you safer today than you were yesterday. Thank you.